This next two-part lecture is going to look more closely at the road to the American Revolution because we've spent a good deal of time now talking about the colonial era in American history and about what life was like before we technically became the United States. But it's time to transition into a time period that began leading us down the road to the Declaration of Independence and the creation of a new form of government. And in this first part of the lecture, we're going to specifically look at two different movements. And really, American life in the 18th century was shaped by the Enlightenment, as well as by a series of religious revivals that were known as the Great Awakening. In a lot of ways, these movements were separate. In some cases, they were even opposite, and they appealed to different groups of people. The Enlightenment was a transatlantic intellectual movement that held that the universe could be understood and improved by the human mind. And then the Great Awakening was a transatlantic religious movement that held that all people were born sinners, that all could feel their own depravity without the assistance of ministers, and that all were equal in the eyes of God. Although the movements might seem fundamentally different and even opposite, with one emphasizing the power of the human mind and the other disparaging it, both criticized established authority and they valued the experience of the individual. And in this way, both contributed to the humanitarianism that emerges at the end of the century, and both are products of capitalism. And in their own way, they're each going to contribute to some of the revolutionary rhetoric and ideology that leads the colonists down the road to independence. The roots of the Enlightenment can be traced to the Renaissance and its spirit of inquiry, as well as its faith in science, which led many explorers during the Age of Exploration, like Christopher Columbus, to come halfway around the globe. And men and women of the Enlightenment on both sides of the Atlantic contrasted the ignorance and oppression and suffering of the Dark Ages, as they would have called them, to their own more enlightened time period. And Thomas Jefferson described the earlier period as the times of vandalism, when ignorance put everything in the hands of power and priestcraft. And instead, enlightened thinkers believed in the power of rational thinking, and they scoffed at these ancient superstitions. People of the Enlightenment believed that God and His world were knowable. They rejected revelation as a guide, and the Enlightenment looked to reason instead. Jefferson's trinity of the three greatest men the world had ever produced included not Jesus Christ, but Isaac Newton, the scientist responsible for modern mathematics and physics, Francis Bacon, the philosopher who outlined the scientific method, and John Locke, the political philosopher of democracy. And the Enlightenment was interested in knowledge not for its own sake, but for the improvements it could make in human happiness. So the true purpose of the Enlightenment then was to reform society using reason in order to advance knowledge through science, such as the scientific revolution. And in essence, the scientific revolution that happened just before and even during parts of the Enlightenment gave these philosophers the confidence that human reason could solve social problems, and then this led them to enact changes in their political ideologies, which would eventually change government systems around the world and lead to many of the Atlantic revolutions. There are four core values of the Enlightenment thinkers, the first being reason, or that truth can be discovered through reason, through rationality, and through observation. The second being happiness, this rejection of the medieval belief that people should concentrate on finding happiness in the hereafter, in heaven, for example, rather than finding contentment and joy in this world. And they believed that humanity's duties were clear and simple, and chief among them, according to Ben Franklin, was, quote, doing good to God's other children. And in fact, people serve God best not by praying, which, as Thomas Paine put it, quote, can add nothing to eternity, but by endeavoring to make his creatures happy. And so scientific inquiry and experiments like Franklin's with electricity all had as their object the improvement of human life. The other two core values are that of progress, that humankind can improve, which is also in some ways similar to humanism, and then liberty. They call for liberties that are achieved through something called the Glorious Revolution, as well as the English Bill of Rights. In Europe, the Enlightenment centered around the salons of Paris and was famous for popular philosophers like Voltaire, Montesquieu, Diderot, and Rousseau. Their political ideas spawned the age of the enlightened despots, people like Frederick the Great of Prussia and Catherine the Great of Russia, both of whom were enlightened more in theory than in fact. The greatest irony, I think, of the Enlightenment is that those political writers saw England as the most enlightened nation in Europe, and yet it was the place where people first revolted, first in the Glorious Revolution of England and later in the American colonies. American political leaders like Jefferson, Franklin, James Otis, John Adams, and others were heavily influenced by Enlightenment thinking. Indeed, it could be said that the most profound result of European Enlightenment was Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, which he himself claimed was a synthesis of American thinking. So from Paris to Berlin to St. Petersburg and Vienna, the rulers of that era became known as enlightened despots. While holding nearly absolute power over their citizens, they considered themselves to be modern and progressive in the sense that they listened to the popular philosophers of the time. These are people like Voltaire and Montesquieu, Rousseau, and others. Those philosophers were offering ideas for new ways to organize society, and the rulers tried to govern in a way that reflected those uplifting ideas. In practice, society probably changed very little during the Age of Reason, but the ideas put forth were advanced for their time. In order for you to really understand the link between the Glorious Revolution, the Enlightenment, and the American Revolution, we really need to start with a little bit of background in New England history first, as well as in a bit of British monarch history. And so, in the year 1685, the King of England, King Charles II, passes away. And when he dies, he doesn't have a legitimate son, so James II becomes England's first Catholic monarch in 127 years. And that's an important thing to remember because the Protestant Reformation for such a long time at this point had kept in power monarchs who practiced Protestantism. So this is an upheaval in the system. And as the Duke of York, James had been very closely involved in the colonial affairs in New York, and he had hoped to consolidate the English colonies into these larger administrative units with very powerful governors similar to the ones that existed in New Spain. So he goes and he revokes the colonial charters to New York and New Jersey, and he folds them into New England as this one single administrative and political entity, and he called it the Dominion of New England. As a powerful English governor and a council then were appointed by the king, and they would rule in this sort of Spanish-style dominion over all of these combined colonies. Their representative assemblies were abolished, which I'm sure you can imagine did not make the people happy, and a reorganized legal system made it far more difficult for the colonists to have any access to the court system. And to extract additional wealth from the colonists, the colonial government then began to raise taxes dramatically, and they revoked the land deeds of the people. So to regain title to their own land, the colonists had to obtain new deeds and pay new taxes on this land that they'd already paid for. So at this point, James II is not particularly popular. He also has a bold agenda to strengthen the royal power at home as well. He seeks to ally England with Catholic France because he is also a Catholic. And James supports religious toleration for Catholics and for dissenters, but he seeks to impose this policy by a royal decree, and therefore he's alienating any potential supporters among dissenters who were sympathetic to his policies. Even more troubling is his attempt to weaken the militia and raise a standing army, which included appointing Catholic officers loyal to the crown, which wouldn't have sat well in a populace that was overwhelmingly Protestant. And finally, James attempted to bypass Parliament altogether and raise revenue through taxation. When the English Parliament refused to accept this radical agenda from King James, the king decided that he was going to entirely dissolve Parliament. So in the autumn of 1688, these English opponents of King James decided that they were going to overthrow him, and they allied themselves with a Protestant Dutch prince named William of Orange, and they ousted James from the throne successfully. And then William was actually married to an English wife named Mary, who ironically was James's own daughter. And so Queen Mary and King William go and reestablish a Protestant monarchy. And you may have heard of them before if you know anything about the College of William and Mary in Virginia, because they're named after this couple. So this fairly bloodless revolution led to the ascension of William III and Mary II, and it was proclaimed a glorious revolution and a vindication of English liberty. Part of what those who dissented against the rule of King James actually required of King William and Queen Mary is that they pass an English Bill of Rights. And they did so in the year 1689, and there are some really important ideas that are cemented in this Bill of Rights that you're also going to see in some of the founding American documents. And these include things like a frequently summoned parliament as well as free elections, so that this is a constitutional monarchy at this point where the king and the queen don't rule with absolute authority, but that authority is tempered by the nobility who sit within the parliament. Members should have freedom of speech within Parliament. No armies can be raised in peacetime, and part of the issue with this is that people were fearful that if there was a standing army, that the ruler, the king or the queen, could use that army against the people. That no taxes could be levied without the authority of Parliament, and we're going to hear this echo in the cry of no taxation without representation when those in the colonies didn't have any kind of representation in Parliament. That laws should not be dispensed with or suspended without the consent of Parliament, and that no excessive fines should be imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. And eventually this is going to become the model for the Declaration of Independence, as well as for the U.S. Bill of Rights. Certainly the impact of the rule of King James and also his overthrow with the Glorious Revolution was felt by the colonists. Most of the colonists had actually suffered under King James II. He had refused to recognize their established colonial charters, and for example, the Massachusetts Bay Colony had been independent for quite some time before he decided to create the Dominion of New England and create one governor in charge of this, and people weren't particularly happy about it. He didn't allow them any say over their laws or over their taxes, and the colonists felt that this king ruled arbitrarily and not fairly. They disliked especially the fact that he had granted a declaration of indulgence, and this declaration granted freedom of worship to Catholics in Maryland. And most of the colonists at this time were Protestant because they came from England, from a place that had been a forerunner in the Protestant Reformation and practiced Anglicanism. And so this king was Catholic, and they worried that he wanted to replace their Protestant institutions with Catholic ones. In fact, they associated Catholicism in this time period with absolutism and absolute monarchy, because France had become Catholic under the rule of Louis XIV, who had in fact been an absolute monarch. So over time, official word of the Glorious Revolution, it took some time to reach the colonies, and rumors about the ascension of William and Mary began to arrive in the spring of 1689. In the colonies, the right to have arms for self-defense was an absolute necessity, and the militia was a really important local institution. In April of 1689, 2,000 militiamen, mostly from country towns, marched on Boston and arrested the governor, and they demanded that there be a restoration of their old charter. Then, in late May, New York's militia took control of that colony. And in Maryland, John Coode actually marched with 700 militiamen to vindicate and assert the sovereign dominion and right of King William and Mary. So Protestant resentment against the power of the Catholic proprietary government had fueled this rebellion, and the Glorious Revolution in America was a victory for representative government, and the notion that a well-regulated militia under local control was the best protection for liberty. So not only did the Glorious Revolution show the people that, one, they could in fact have a representative government, and two, they could have their own well-regulated militia, but three, that it was possible to overthrow a monarch, even if in this case it was just to put in place a constitutional monarchy. Perhaps as a result of the Glorious Revolution, Enlightenment thinkers began to study the connection between society, politics, and the economy. And our first Enlightenment thinker that we're going to talk about was François-Marie Arouet, who you all know as Voltaire. This was his nom de plume, and he was a French Enlightenment writer, a historian, as well as a philosopher. He was famous for his wit, as well as for the fact that he often attacked clergy, aristocracy, and government authority. And his advocacy of freedom of religion, freedom of expression, and separation of church and state. And Voltaire was a very versatile writer, and he produced works in almost every single literary form. These included plays and poems and novels and essays and historical and even scientific works, and he wrote more than 20,000 letters and more than 2,000 books and pamphlets. He was certainly an outspoken advocate, despite the fact that this often put him at risk because there were very strict censorship laws at the time. And as a satirical writer, he was frequently making use of his works to criticize intolerance and superstition and religious dogma, as well as the French institutions of his day. And in fact, at one point he was jailed and exiled for his beliefs, and because he was very often corresponding directly with many rulers in an attempt to help reach them with this new Enlightenment philosophy. Probably one of the most influential of the Enlightenment thinkers was John Locke, and Locke was infamous for the fact that he believed that human nature was essentially good, and that humans were born with natural rights of life, liberty, and property, and this may seem familiar to you, the idea of the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. And it comes from this where he writes the two treatises on government, and he argues that men are created equal in a state of nature and are thus endowed with certain natural rights. And he felt that the government's purpose was to protect those natural rights, and that if the government abused its authority, as he believed Britain had, that the people had the right to then overthrow the government. He also came up with what is called the social contract theory of government, and he held that there was a contract, essentially, between the ruler and the subject, and that if the ruler were to break this contract, and if the government was no longer in the best interest of the subject, that it could then be broken by the people. So, in fact, this is interesting because this social contract theory of government was used for the first time as grounds in the first American divorce case, and it was argued by Thomas Jefferson, and he also argued that marriage was a contract between a man and a woman, and that if that contract was no longer beneficial to both the man as well as to the woman, that they should then have the right to dissolve the contract, much like you could with the government. Our next Enlightenment philosopher is Montesquieu, and he was a French lawyer as well as a political philosopher. He was also the first person to apply methods of classification to various political forms in human societies, and that's something that social and political anthropologists do today. So his political and social anthropology then gave rise to various theories on government, which we still use today. And his work was used in many different societies, especially in America and France. He wrote a book called The Spirit of the Laws, and this book was about the importance of a balance of power within British government. He believed essentially that all government came in three forms. You have the executive, the legislative, and the judicial, and also that each of these should be separate from and dependent of the other, so that the influence of any one power doesn't exceed that of the other two. And this very radical idea is used in France, for example, to eliminate the three estate structure of the French monarchy and also to help lead to the French Revolution. But it's used in the United States. What we're most familiar with is this separation of powers and also checks and balances that are part of the U.S. Constitution, that our legislative branch and our executive branch and our judicial branch cannot have more power than any other, and that it doesn't control the other branches. Another thing that's really interesting about Montesquieu is that once we get into the 19th century and talk about the abolitionist movement, many of his ideas are used by abolitionists because he's one of the first Enlightenment thinkers to advance major reforms about slavery. And I think it's very interesting that, on the one hand, he has all of these ideas about a separation of powers and checks and balances and reforming or eliminating slavery, but on the other hand, he held a number of views that today would probably be very controversial. He firmly accepted the role of a hereditary aristocracy. He believed in the value of primogeniture, and while he did say that a woman could be a head of state, he also wrote that she could not be effective as the head of a family. So while many of his opinions were very forward-thinking, he still certainly had some of the views that were very prominent for this time period. So after looking at just a couple of important Enlightenment philosophers, you can probably summarize that the Enlightenment was a time period that stretched from the mid-17th century through to the 18th century. And throughout this time period, people began to embrace several revolutions, those in science and philosophy, as well as in society and politics. And the revolutions really start to sweep away this medieval world of the Dark Ages, and they usher in the modern Western world that we know today. And Enlightenment thinking, especially during the American Revolution and then during the French Revolution, challenges that traditional hierarchical political and social order, the one where you've got a king and a queen up at the top of this hierarchy, and then you've got the commoners down at the bottom and several ranks in between. It also challenged the authority of the Catholic Church, which had really been in charge of day-to-day life as well as the government in many ways for quite some time in the Western world. And it ushered in ideals of equality and freedom for everyone, founded upon these principles of human reason and logic, and upon the belief that there are certain rights that are natural and inalienable that all people should have. So it might seem then that the Enlightenment would be really the antithesis of religious institutions, and that it would have a negative impact on the Anglican Church within the colonies. But Anglicans were actually really receptive to Enlightenment ideals, and especially to those of moderation and of rationalism. They welcomed a departure from the Inquisition and from the early modern witch hunts, and the idea of having faith without being allowed to use any reason. And so they started preaching a much more comforting form of Christianity in which God was good and just, and he required nothing, quote, that is either unsuitable to our reason or prejudicial to our interest, nothing but what is easy to be understood and is as easy to be practiced by an honest and willing mind. So this message was popular in the colonies. The idea that one could follow God and obey reason became one and the same in this time period.